The PlayStation 1 era of gaming is home to some of the best JRPGs ever made. While this is a genre that is still going strong to this very day, it's undeniable that there was a specific charm to those older JRPGs that is missing today, which is partially thanks to the limitations of hardware present at the time. Developers couldn't give us hyper-realistic open worlds to immerse ourselves into, so they compensated for that with lots of lore, heartfelt world building, and so much dialogue that it could rival a book. When you ask most people what games defined the genre in those years, they would mention names like Final Fantasy VII, Xenogears, Vagrant Story, Chrono Cross, Breath of Fire 4, Parasite Eve, Star Ocean 2, Legend of Mana, and Persona 2. After all, these were all popular on a mainstream level, and they did define other games that came alongside them since they felt like a complete package that had everything in one place. But it's not just about the popular titles, right? When you dig deeper into any genre and any generation of gaming, you stumble upon lesser-known gems that are just as amazing as those games that sold tens of millions of units. Two such games that the hardcore JRPG fans may know, but the casual gamer does not, are The Legend of Dragoon and Legend of Legaia. The Legend of Dragoon sold over 1 million copies, but received mixed reviews at the time because critics found the Final Fantasy series more innovative at the time. However, over time, it has developed a cult following that appreciates it just as much as its competition. Meanwhile, Legend of Legaia sold less than Dragoon, but it was reviewed better in comparison since it felt a bit less similar to the Final Fantasy games. Thus, a comparison was not drawn out in the same way. Back in those days, these two games competed against the better-known games that I already mentioned earlier. But today, The Legend of Dragoon and The Legend of Legaia will compete against each other as we break the two games down and determine which one is the better JRPG with the word legend in its name. Graphics. Before you play, you see what's in front of you once you launch the game. Both Dragoon and Legaia are PlayStation 1 games, so you obviously can't expect to see anything outworldly in terms of the visual quality when looking backwards. Yes, it felt like real life when we saw those games as kids, but in 2024, things change a bit when you look back. Let's start with The Legend of Dragoon. The game has great graphics for its time. The character models look good and varied. The environments are pre-rendered, but offer a lot of detail. Some of the areas in the game look downright gorgeous, and even the simpler ones still have something to offer. One thing in particular that I really like about the game is that it doesn't offer chibi character models in traversal. You still play as fully 3D characters when walking around the environment. On the other hand, Legend of Legaia feels less realistic. Firstly, it has the chibi character models when you're exploring the land. And secondly, while some of the locations in the game look pretty good, others can appear bland and empty. However, one important thing to note here is that Legaia does not feature pre-rendered backgrounds. Instead, it features fully 3D environments, which was very rare for the PlayStation 1 in the JRPG genre. So this part does compensate a bit for the lack of creative environmental design. Furthermore, Legaia features a system in which you first visit a sick version of places, but once you complete the area, it's healed and looks a bit different. So even if the graphics of Legaia are a bit inferior to Dragoon, it at least makes up for it in other ways. But overall, Dragoon does take the cake, because it just aesthetically feels more detailed, especially since its UI and menus are designed to look better as well. When you explore your menus and inventory in Legaia, it feels very bare bone. The sound. The sound design of both games is on par with each other. Dragoon has some very great tunes to listen to, and it perfectly fits the magical world that you're thrown into. I especially love the style that the game's music brings to the table, such as when you enter the menu, there's a designated theme for it too. The voice acting of the game could have been a bit better though.
Dot. Father?
But the fact that it had voice acting at all is still pretty great for the time that it came out in. Much of the same can be said for Legaia, except that some consider the voice acting to be a bit better here. And the in-battle sound effects in Legaia are better for me personally, as the attacks and character voices sound higher quality. Although this may be up to preference at the end of the day. It's really hard to pick a side here, and I'd say both games are equal in terms of the sound quality, with similar ups and downs. The gameplay. Now, this is the most important part of both games, since, well, they are video games that you play. Let's first start off with the similarities. Both games are JRPGs that feature turn-based combat. In both games, you form parties, manage your inventory, unlock new types of abilities to use in fights, traverse back and forth between the world for things, discover secret items to become stronger, grind your levels to be able to fight stronger bosses, and so on. What differentiates the two games are pacing, difficulty, and the gimmick in their combat. Since this is a versus video, we're going to be focusing on the shortcomings of the two games, comparing them, and then seeing which one fares off better. The Legend of Dragoon starts off pretty fast and flashy, but after the first 4 to 5 hours, the game starts to slow down. Players who are fine with slow pacing and giving things time to shine stick around, while many others do not continue past this point because it starts to feel like a bit of a chore to them. Some people did go back to the game and eventually learned that the pace of the game picks up later on, but things like having to farm the additions, which is the game's version of additional abilities for characters, for each character to finally unlock their final one, is something that is extremely grindy. I agree that the pacing is an issue to many, but it is sort of necessary. The story may look to many as if it is progressing too slowly, but it's not about flashiness all the time. While the game's narrative momentum slowing down might be a negative factor for many, this is kind of necessary for the development of characters. However, the pacing really could have been better, as it does require much more grind, which is essential for character progression, but it can feel repetitive and time-consuming. Furthermore, the game generally feels slow in some cases, as there are a lot of animations that take up your time every time there's a fight. The backtracking is time-consuming too, due to the way the game's travel works, and even opening the menu has a few seconds of a gap before it appears. The inventory in the game is pretty small in general, and since you use consumable items a lot in the game, it can get really annoying if you're someone who likes to collect items. Traveling between locations can be time-consuming, and the limited inventory space exacerbates the issue, especially for players who enjoy collecting items and resources throughout their journey. These design choices contribute to a sense of stagnation and hinder the overall flow of the gameplay experience. Last but not least, people are usually divided on the game's combat system. It features a quick-time event-like system where you have to press specific buttons when prompted when engaging in turn-based fights. Wrong timing can lead to less fruitful results, so not everyone is a fan of this system. But at the same time, this gimmick does set it apart from other games in the genre, and thus many people enjoy it too. Some really do appreciate the added layer of interactivity and skill required, while others find it frustrating and prefer a more traditional turn-based approach. The inclusion of QTEs sets The Legend of Dragoon apart from its peers in the JRPG genre, but also contributes to its divisive reception among players. In contrast, The Legend of Legaia offers a more streamlined and immersive combat system that resonates with players who prefer traditional turn-based mechanics. The ability to input sequences of strikes to execute specific moves adds depth and strategy to battles, reminiscent of a fighting game's combos. This unique approach to combat enhances the sense of agency and engagement for players, making each encounter feel dynamic and strategic. Now, when it comes to Legend of Legaia, people have their own complaints. First of all, the pacing of Legaia has its own set of issues as well, which are caused by the need to grind, as some of the enemies in the game are extremely powerful. Unlike Dragoon, which is easier to cheese with specific party compositions, Legaia doesn't give the player much of a choice, and you have to grind in order to defeat some of the late-game bosses. Despite these shortcomings, both games exhibit timeless qualities that appeal to fans of the JRPG genre. The Legend of Dragoon's cinematic presentation and unique combat mechanics offer a compelling narrative experience, while Legend of Legaia's strategic depth and immersive gameplay mechanics provide a more traditional yet satisfying journey. The game has some cool ideas, such as how the player can enter a sequence of strikes separated into categories such as high, low, right, and left. And you can create sequences that turn into arts, which lead to your characters performing specific moves. It's like a unique turn-based version of a fighting game's moveset. Because of this, the combat of Legaia is a bit more immersive for many when compared to the combat of Dragoon, especially if they don't like the QTEs. It's a more traditional JRPG in a way, and its pacing only suffers because of the grinding aspect. Otherwise, it's a faster-paced game. Both games clearly have their own merits and flaws. And what's interesting is that the flaws are not exactly objective. It boils down to preference more, since some people may prefer the slower pace of Dragoon more, as it's a very calming game with a less depressing atmosphere, whereas Legaia feels more anxious and a bit more grim, and that translates into its quicker gameplay pace as well. Neither game truly innovates the genre, so it's not easy to pick a winner in this category. Instead, they're both beautifully crafted JRPGs that have aged pretty well, and those who have nostalgia for them love them even more. So I think it really does come down to player preference in terms of which has better gameplay. The only thing I can pick a side on here is that I overall prefer Legend of Legaia's pacing, because even most fans of Dragoon admit that it does have very slow periods. And for a game that can take up to 45 hours of time to beat, that can be a big turnoff. Ultimately, the preference between the two games comes down to individual tastes and priorities. Some players may value The Legend of Dragoon's atmospheric world building and cinematic flair, while others may gravitate towards Legend of Legaia's strategic depth and immersive combat system. Regardless of personal preference, both games stand as a testament to the enduring appeal of classic JRPGs and continue to captivate audiences with their rich storytelling and engaging gameplay. So the battle between the best gameplay has finally concluded, but selecting the better one seems a bit hard. While it is difficult to conclude the overall guide, yet another main aspect is left. The story and the characters will help determine which one is better. So let's dive straight into it. The story and characters. Unlike some other genres where great gameplay can make up for a bad story, the story matters heavily in JRPGs, because you spend a lot of time with the game's world, characters, and reading through pages of dialogue. The Legend of Dragoon starts off pretty simple in terms of its story, but then it evolves into a larger plot with many moving parts. The protagonist is not silent, the villains are interesting, the lore is detailed, and there are tons of characters to explore as there are several protagonists. Not to mention the supporting cast is interesting as well. The translation of the game sucks a bit, so some of the dialogue feels monotonous. But you can use some fan patches to improve that if you know your way around technology. Legend of Legaia is the opposite in some ways. It starts off more dynamically in comparison, but it has less twists and turns. The story is a bit more straightforward and does not have as many moving parts as its competitor. However, it makes up for this a bit in the fact that it has a far more atmospheric story that is dark and depressing, but without being too edgy. Both games have the usual, "You're a hero that can summon creatures to help you or merge with you, and you need to save the world" story. But Legaia extends this concept by putting you in a world that is already doomed. And what you can do is try to heal as much of it as possible. The characters in Legaia do have their moments, but they are a bit less detailed in terms of storyline when compared to Dragoon, which tries to develop them more. And the protagonist of Legaia is silent too, which makes Dart more interesting in comparison by default. The argument for which game is better might not satisfy many, as it's all about having fun. If you like Legend of Dragoon, then you should enjoy it. And if you like Legend of Legaia, you should experience its goodness. However, when compared in terms of story and characters, the former takes the win. The Legend of Dragoon could be more fun in some aspects, as the character models and graphics are better than the Legend of Legaia. The story is also very well written, and is immersive in nature. The main reason for Legend of Dragoon to feature a better story and characters could be the higher budget that it had. The lore of both games is a lot deeper than it appears. This is more the case in The Legend of Dragoon, as it has some of the best villains. Also, the impression that Divine Dragon made arguably lasted throughout the entire run. There are also characters like Dart, Meru, and Kongol that make your in-game even better. These are hailed as the best characters in the game, with Meru being the best. While many people will have different perspectives, as not everyone enjoys the same character type. With many characters available, it wouldn't be surprising for anyone to have a different opinion. However, the same cannot be said when there is a comparison between two games. While both games provide a great experience, the storytelling and the characters of The Legend of Dragoon are superior. Even though Legend of Legaia has characters like Vaughn, the win goes to the former. Much like other aspects that we went over, it's hard to pick a clear winner between the two games in terms of story. However, there is more to be found in terms of lore and character development in Legend of Dragoon than in Legaia, and because of this, Dragoon pulls into the lead. Now, this outcome shouldn't have been a surprise to you, as the difference in story is quite clear. One game has a slow start, but features many plots and twists that gives you a better experience, while the other one starts off better, but has little to no plot twists or good moments later on. The winner! As we've compared every aspect of the two games, it's quite clear that they are both excellent JRPG games that took every great factor of the genre in the era that they came out in and utilized them to the max to make the best possible games that you could buy for a PlayStation 1. And most of the differences that the two have are the kind that comes down to preference, rather than something that you can call objectively bad. Having to grind a lot, for example, is something that clearly sucks. But both games have their own version of requiring this from the player, due to which we can't call one game better than the other. On the other hand, things that do differ from each other are simply things that one person may like and another person may not. So whether The Legend of Dragoon is a better game or Legend of Legaia is, it all comes down to what you want to play. If you're a patient gamer who wants a slow-paced JRPG that constantly goes through pacing issues and requires a lot of grind in order to get the best skills for your characters, then the lore, world-building, gameplay, and story of The Legend of Dragoon will be the best for you, and you might like it more than Legaia. If you're a gamer who wants their game to feel faster and wants something more depressing, even if it is at the cost of not having a complex storyline, then Legend of Legaia is the game for you, as it's more accessible for someone who is going back to the good old days of gaming. The only thing we can really pick a side on are the graphics, because Legend of Dragoon has aged way better in terms of its art design, environments, and character models. Legend of Legaia has its merits visually, but they fall short due to the chibi models and some of the areas looking rather bland. We hope that you found this competition fun, as we tried our best to be neutral, unbiased, and factually accurate when comparing the pros and cons of these two games. And before you go, do make sure to let us know which of these two JRPGs you personally prefer as well. After all, we do have our favorites.